I'm just waiting to see if it's updated. It's not yet streaming anything. Do you have OBS Studio streaming to this key? It is. Okay. Maybe it just takes a while. Oh, here we go. I've got it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's all good. One sec, I just have to put it in presenter mode so I can pull up speaker notes and not. So, do you guys see the side panels here, or do you just see the main screen? Okay. Okay, so now do you just see the main screen, no side panels? Okay. Oh, wait a sec.
Hey guys, I'm sorry for the background noise. Could someone just drop a link to the live stream in the chat? I mean, obviously I can listen to it here, but I might want to share the link.
Yeah, I'm sharing it in Facebook right now as well. Is there a title that you use for this, Lennon?
Yes. If you can see on screen, the title is "Do I Think?
Oh, that's
Does
the
a
title. Okay.
Submarine
I thought that was
Swim?"
a quote. Okay.
It is a
Do
quote.
I think does a submarine swim? All right. Zenyatta. There we go.
Shall I commence?
Yeah, sure.
Hello. Thank you for coming to my review on the mental and the physical. This is Zenyatta. He's an Omnic from the game Overwatch, and he asks us, "Do I think? Does a submarine swim?" This is the title of today's review. For the purposes of this review, I shall be adopting a deflationary lens and a common sense regular way of interpretation as a means to glean appropriate depth of some of the vast constructs discussed. For the sake of brevity, I will only be reviewing the first 30 pages of Feigl's The Mental and the Physical today. Feel free to ask clarifying questions. A central question to the text. How are the raw feels related to behavioral or neurophysiological states? Or, if we prefer the formal mode of speech to the material mode, what are the logical relations of raw feel talk, aka phenomenal terms, if not phenomenal language, to the terms and statements in the language of behavior? Relatedly, suppose we could predict the detailed chemical structure of an entirely new perfume, which will be manufactured in Paris in the year 1995. This paper was written in 1958. Suppose, furthermore, that we could equally exactly predict the neurophysiological effects of this perfume on the mucous membranes of a human nose, as well as the resulting cortical processes in the person thus smelling the perfume. Could we then also predict the quality of the experienced fragrance? These questions and thought, along with the upcoming outline positions, are the primary reasons why I've selected this text for review. Feigl begins with an outline of the history of thought on the positions of mind. Of the history of thought of positions on the mind. Importantly, touching on materialism, mentalism, mind-body interactionalism, evolutionary emergence theories, psychoneurophysiological parallelism, which includes epiphenomenalism, isomorphism, double aspect theories, and neutral monism. I shall be going over these shortly. These logical possibilities are well to be identified early, especially as they reflect mainstay views and capture basic philosophical intuitions. Further, they set good groundwork for sensible positions one could hold. Of note, these are not the only positions a person could have about reality and the minds within it. It is very possible to conceive of a sort of triism as opposed to dualism, where a third category of thing that exists, such as fate or maybe a transcendental entity, could be realized. These views could further be hybridized and complicated. For instance, in asserting that in order for a mental experience to be recognized as a sort as we would endow with human subjectivity, perhaps a certain degree of emergence must be met, and before that it is merely material constituting biological life. To clarify, for the purpose of this review, materialism is basically that reality just consists of matter and energy. Mentalism is that brain states do not causally generate mind states. Evolutionary emergence could be thought of to be that the mind emerges through material interactions of sufficient complexity. And this idea, I would say, is very related to the notion of the whole being more than the sum of its parts. Neuropsychological parallelism, which would be that the mind and brain operate alongside each other and have some degree of correspondence, but not necessarily supervenience. Finally, neutral monism, which is that both mentalistic concepts of psychology and physics are concepts that are logically constituted out of neutral data, which is kind of a more removed, stepped back perspective, I would say. I hope these views provide some foundation as to perspectives that members of Carbon Copies might mull over. An important point and something that Feigl clarifies early on is the difference between two different clarifications of the term physical, which he goes on in this paper to reference in separate capacities. Of note, this is the beginning of how Feigl broaches the groundwork not at the heart of the discrepancy between the mental and the physical, but rather as a clarification of terminology to serve as a backbone to his developed out work. That is to say, due to these terms being in our language so broad that he is kind of sub-referring to the physical in a particular way when I'm going to be discussing the physical one and physical two. So physical one is to mean the degree of precise and specific in-principle predictability that even modern quantum mechanics would allow as regards to the macro and some of the micro processes in organisms. And by physical two, he means the type of concepts and laws which suffice in principle for the explanation and prediction of inorganic processes. If emergentism is not required for the phenomena of organic life, physical would mean those concepts and laws sufficient for the explanation of inorganic processes as well as biological phenomena. It is noteworthy that Feigl establishes both forms of physical to be tied to predictability, as you can see. This perhaps indicates an underlying assumption worth further examination. As previously mentioned, the notion of sufficient explanation is something critical to Feigl's work in this paper. It begs the questions as to what constitutes a sufficient explanation. On page 3, Feigl claims that Newtonian physics as an explanation of electromagnetic radiation are now regarded as insufficient due to advancements of quantum mechanics. But what constitutes a sufficient explanation for phenomena? For instance, you could talk about mathematical explainability by assignment of points of data or quantification of forces. Does sufficient explanation mean to be able to be shown in a model? What would be the standards for the model? Does he mean understandably explainable, like I ran here faster than the water, so I didn't get wet. So an example he uses to kind of illustrate his point is that the concept of a magnetic field, while not denoting anything directly observable, can be introduced with the help of postulates and correspondence rules. But a counterpoint to that would be that you don't need correspondence rules to figure out that magnets produce magnetic fields. You can directly feel magnets and their magnetic fields. You can, with your hand, actually pick up a magnet and see, oh, there's something going on here. To continue with the notion of sufficiency, physical laws serving as explanations and predictions for human behavior is a central point to Feigl's work in the paper. He uses this as a basis of terminology going forward, such as in this passage. The question remains whether or not such, quote, emergent concepts are really needed and whether or not they will do the expected job in the explanation and prediction of the behavior of organisms, subhuman or human. And it's his personal view, while admittedly tentative based on the progress and partial success of physicalistic micro-explanation, that the effect that physical 2, as previously mentioned, laws will prove sufficient. On a personal note, this view, which could be called mental or phenomenological physicalist reductionism, I know it's a bit of a mouthful, closely resembles my own with a few caveats. I don't believe in magic or soul or any sort of transcendental hand-waving. Vitalism. A lot of words. Traditional vitalism, culturally and historically, is perhaps a descendant of a more primitive form of animism, and it stresses the capricious nature of vis vitalis and anima. There's a classic Humean example here of a billiard ball impacting another, and how we assume causation from that. But interaction need not be indeterministic in the wider system. The winds and waves of the sea genuinely interact, even if the wind's influence is quantitatively greater. The waves do have some effect upon the air currents nearby, but through precise prediction of detail, it is practically extremely difficult because of the enormous complexities of the situation. This type of interaction is in principle deterministically analyzable in terms of the functional relations of the two types of variables. Even the individual, free or capricious, momentary choices of our boy might be predictable in principle, but here the practical feasibility is far beyond the horizon of current psychology, and at best only some statistical regularities might be formulated. This is excellently put by Feigl. Despite the data which his paper was published, this passage summarizes a central idea and point of contention between camps of thought. On the one hand, we have determinists, and on the other hand, we have skeptics or agnostics or free will proponents. Vitalism is actually opposed to what the mission of carbon copies is. For under a strict vitalist view, if biological processes and laws cannot be explained or manifested through physical means, then the work of whole brain emulation can't be done, unless the needed steps for establishing a mind, whether they be upbringing, certain neurological milestones in development, or cultural/mimetic impact, are also realized in our endeavor. As Feigl puts it on page 7, according to the vitalist interactionalist doctrine, the volitions of the boy are in principle unpredictable on the basis of any and all antecedent conditions in his organism and the environment. So Feigl gets to a rather juicy point next. He turns to an empirical test and claims he can show the difference between interactionalism and emergentism versus parallelism. He defines an interaction when causal relations occur between two continuants. He claims that an interaction is anything discernible that changes in another system, where there's an element of relatedness between any part of that system and another, which is a pretty good definition. Feigl clarifies that isomorphism, which is a view that, if described accurately here, many in the modern age would be sympathetic to, would be a one-to-one correspondence that exceeds that of parallelism, in that mind states would be uniquely inferable from particular neurophysiological conditions rather than a range of potential values having some parallel to particular mind states. And here a test is introduced. Feigl claims that with an autocerebroscope, which is, I love that term, it would be possible to observe a subject give a verbal avowal of their introspection on their volitions, and determining, while doing so, the data corresponding to the autocerebroscope stream would correlate. And then depending on, would correlate or not, depending on the hypothesis of interactionalism versus emergentism and parallelism. This is a bold claim. I have a few questions for Feigl. At what time point would the avowal be measured? How would you eliminate confounds such as distracting thoughts or slips in attention? There'll always be a fluctuation of chemicals through synapses. At what level of precision in correlates of chart readout would actually mean anything like a verbal avowal? Furthermore, could not a proponent of interactionalism claim that a different layer of scale, either further down or further up, was the thing producing the phenomenal experience and what was being measured by this autocerebroscope? And what was being measured by this autocerebroscope was merely a fascinating correspondence or coincidence. Could we not expect standards of evidence or degree of precision in models when considering things at this level? And finally, if someone's phenomenology could not be expressed by a person linguistically, finally, all of someone's phenomenology could not be explained by a person linguistically, and in starting to explain it, their phenomenology would change, as it's constantly doing. This is no minor point for Feigl, this notion of the autocerebroscope. A direct quote from him is that most direct evidence one could ever hope for as regards to the confirmation of mind state to brain state action regarding what would be gleaned by this test. So this is a fantastic device, and the questions I have posed could spawn entire disciplines of study. Indeed, those at the Qualia Research Institute, which we've done interviews for, I believe are attempting to do just this, and I urge development to be done in these areas. Feigl outlines a principal case against interactionalism. So interactionism, so conceived, assumes causal relations between the elements in the series of mental states, the series of physical states, but also some crossing from the set of mental states to the physical ones and vice versa. In the model of the winds and the waves, which was aforementioned, we have precisely this sort of schema exemplified. But there's a crucial difference. In a closed system, or a system with known initial and boundary conditions, it is conceivable in which all relevant variables are ascertainable intersubjectively and antecedently to the prediction of later states of the system. Whereas in the case of mind-brain interaction, intersubjective and antecedent confirmation of the mind states are, due to the hypothesis, excluded. This is problematic for a lot of philosophers and people who have dedicated a lot of thought and effort to these problems, because it leads to these kind of dubious ex post facto explanations, which are profoundly unsatisfying. It's relevant, I think, that scientists are largely concerned with enlarging the scope of predictive explanations, and that interactionism kind of undermines that. So we now get to kind of the meat of what a lot of Feigl is attempting to do here with putting the mental versus the physical. He begins with some groundwork. The mental and the physical are precariously ambiguous and vague. Hence, a prerequisite for the clarification and the adequate settlement of the main issues is an analytical study of the meanings of each of these two key terms, and a comparative critical appraisal of the merits and demerits of their various definitions and connotations. So he begins with kind of opening remarks which urge clarity and parsimony, resorting to naturalistic accounts rather than transcendental or immaterial, he thinks is pertinent. And he also says that we should identify the relations in an ordinary way. That is to say, things like tension, vigilance, enthusiasm, grief, indignation, expectations, remembrances, hopes, wishes, etc., if they're not among the causal factors which produce human behavior, that kind of flies in the face of the commonest form of evidence. or else it deviates in a strange and unjustifiable way from ordinary use of language. So he claims that the task is neither to repudiate these obvious facts, nor rule them out in a manner of describing them, but it's rather to analyze the logical status of this sort of description in its relation to behavioral or neurophysiological descriptions. Continuing further in demarcating these two terms, he advocates for the character of the clarification and for intersubjective confirmability, immediate experience as confirmation, and realistic as opposed to phenomenalist and operationalist accounts of empirical knowledge. He concludes with the analysis and connotations and association with these terms. Regarding number 5, I think it's curious as to why Feigl would foray into scientific general practice and standards when his general purpose is to give an account of these two major ideas of things that fall within the realm of the mental as opposed to the physical. Using general scientific guidelines is a questionable choice for assessing the parameters of foundational philosophical theory. This is further brought into question upon Feigl contesting that, quote, purely phenomenal statements make sense and are ultimate epistemic basis of confirmation of knowledge claims. As for number 6, this is a radically different approach, and arguably linguistic or cultural, to tackling the problem than measures of intersubjective empirical observation. So he's kind of going for a grab bag here. In further distinction, he says concepts that are like just kind of associated with these two big constructs are that purposive versus mechanical. Intelligence is associated with the mental, utilizing a means as towards an attainment of ends. That's purposive versus mechanical, such as intricate behavior does not denote rich inner life, like as with bees, which have high degree of mechanical complexity. Further, intentional versus non-intentional. So he's wise to point to the distinction between conscious aims and purposive behavior. And relatedly, acts directed upon objects for being a prerequisite for mental life is a given in many philosophies, such as Husserl's. This is, of course, related to intentionality, which is a central developed notion in Husserl's work. On page 15, Feigl gets into the notion of identicality. Imagine two thermometers in the same glass. They have the same temperature, but their recordings are not numerically identical. That is to say, the events taking place in each are not identical. A quote here is that, suffice it to say, to point out that the phrases the same as and identical with are ambiguously used. Sameness or identity may mean complete similarity, such as in the case of two musical experiences, or in the case of two thermometric indications. But sameness or identity in other contexts means the numerical oneness of the individual referent of two different names or two different unique characterizations. He concludes, then it makes perfectly good sense to speak of subjectively or privately, the subjectivity or privacy of immediate experience being numerically different but qualitatively identical experiences may be had by two or more persons, but the experiential events are being private to each of the distinct persons. So this has striking similarity to our phenomenology, which from second to second, our experience changes. And is the identification of the context in regards to identity something worth meditating on, as he says in sameness or identity in other contexts means numerical oneness or individual referent of. Is this identified indistinguishability, as he notes, is that for humans under normal circumstances? Is that at a subatomic level of indistinguishability? On page 15, Feigl claims that trouble arises when we state that private experiences are objective. He cites pain experienced by one who has a heart attack, claiming that objectivity is to mean a complete historical account of our universe. And this seems to actually provide a robust ground for demarcating between the subjective and objective in everyday language. However, Feigl goes on to discuss a different philosophical category of entities called absolute subjective or private. In this, he refers to experience that would require purely private language, and thus would be scientifically, but not cognitively, meaningless. So Feigl's inclination to wrap up intersubjective communication with scientific credibility does indeed conform to a perspective of science as an enterprise, but is limited regarding science as a systematic process or history of knowledge. Feigl makes a sensical case that it is meaningless to talk about the length or breadth of motherly love, claiming that it is silly to talk about the location of a concept. This argument no doubt has draw. However, imagine a position such as the following. A strict materialist who believes that mental states are only byproducts of physical neural states runs into a linguistic pragmatist who believes language is how it's used, with an Ortegan bent. And thus a new view is born, one that holds that all conceptual language is a property of human history emanating or emerging from the collective happening of human lives, which are in turn byproducts of physical laws, thus rendering the assessment of the length of love mathematically definable in terms of the aggregation of mental concepts throughout humanity that correspond to it. So this view could kind of be considered a counter to what Feigl asks and claims when he says, can we give a natural translation of the language of reasoning as it occurs in arguments, i.e. discourse in which we give reasons intended to support knowledge claims or value judgments? And he thinks that it becomes increasingly clear that the answer must be a negative. This, what I've outlined here in the second half of this, is counter to that. But he goes on, but not because human behavior is involving higher thought processes is not in principle capable of physical explanation and prediction, rather because the problem is one of logical reducibility or irreducibility of discourse involving aboutness to the language of behavioral or neurophysiological description. On page 10, Feigl has a wonderfully articulated passage where he talks about where he gives a synopsis of making free will choices. He relevantly identifies at the moment of choice if we are not making decisions under some sort of coercion or compulsion, and instead we are acting in accordance with what we would consider to be our core desires, then we are the doers of our deeds and the makers of our decisions. While this seems to be a very commonsensical understanding of freedom, for which Feigl deserves major props, it's at odds with multiple other sections in which it is claimed that A, only the individual can report on their subjective experience, B, that physical laws will prove sufficient for instantiating the mind/interactionism that Feigl rejects, and that introspection is often unreliable. Reading this paper has underscored that it is very difficult to write at length about philosophy of mind without some degree of apparent contradiction in assumptions or terminology. Thank you for coming to my review on the mental and the physical, and I'm happy to take any further clarifying questions.
Thank you very much. Awesome. I'm pretty sure that for many of your listeners, there were a ton of philosophy terms in here that they're not entirely sure about, so you may get some questions on that. I do have some questions that I've set aside, and I'd love for everyone else to chime in first, but I wanted to ask one thing just up front, just to make sure that this is said. What is the message that you want us to take home from this review?
I don't know if there's a singular message per se, but
Is there a plural message?
Yeah, I guess that one of the main things is that there's a variety of potential views on philosophy of mind, and that people within carbon copies and people who are going in the field of whole brain emulation and concerned with physical instantiations of minds should be aware of. And I guess too that there's also more work to be done, and it's as I concluded with, it's difficult to write at length on these sorts of things without some degree of contradiction.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, this was an example for us, showing us that there are multiple views that people can take, or multiple approaches that persons can take, and to show that we certainly could learn something from reading the philosophy literature and all of the different approaches that have been tried. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right. Let me just let everyone else ask their questions first before I dive in. Come on, you people with hundreds of questions. No raised hands.
I mean, I guess one of the most important ones is, like, vitalism is opposed to what the mission of carbon copies is. If it's in principle unpredictable, the basis of, what an organism does, if biological processes and laws cannot explain or be manifested through physical means, then whole brain emulation can't really be, exactly what I said on the slide. It can't really be done unless the needed steps for establishing a mind are realized.
What would you deem in principle unpredictable? And I know you mentioned this in your presentation, but it might be good to just restate. So the vitalist view, in a sense.
Well, I don't ascribe to a vitalist view.
No, I know.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating question. Like, what is the nature of unpredictability, if you will, or something, if I understood your question correctly?
Yeah, like what would a vitalist say? What would be the thing that makes that not suitable for pursuing whole brain emulation? What kind of unpredictability are we talking about here?
Give me a sec. I mean, I can imagine a wide variety of different, bents, if you will, of vitalism, but I think something common that a person, I think commonly person might appeal to, some sort of transcendental lens. Like they might say that, maybe through God's will, or maybe there's a spark of divinity within every organism or something that makes it so that fully fully emulating an organism in anything other than the quote natural way of doing things won't be in some fundamental way. It won't be right, I guess, and therefore it won't.
Okay.
There won't be behavior in the same way.
What about
It will be.
What about natural sources of unpredictability, like what we might call noise, or things that make individual neurons and circuits and entire brains seem unpredictable to the scientific observer, at least to some degree,
Mhm.
because there's noise in the system. Where would you put that in all of this?
Hmm.
Is that what the vitalist means, or is this very different? Because I suspect that's different from what the vitalist would have as an objection. I think
Yeah.
that's why I asked what kind of unpredictability, because you could say, for instance, that the weather is completely unpredictable, and yet we have people whose job it is to predict the weather every day.
Yeah. So that's kind of getting to let's see. I think it's that's kind of getting to the wind and the waves, right? So
Yeah.
there's or maybe is that the right one? Yeah, I think it's this one. So yeah, all relevant variables are ascertainable intersubjectively. That's kind of I don't think that's at the heart of what a lot of vitalism would get at. I think that would be like something like, we just need to go further in our understanding and quantification of things.
Right. Or we need to decide that the level that we're interested in is one where we don't need to be able to ascertain every one of the variables
Yeah,
independently. Right.
totally.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Could you possibly just restate why Feigl thinks that a sense of unpredictability is due to something other than just a lack of the means to take measurements? Like why? Because what I'm understanding is that the main argument for the vitality, I hope I got that term right, is that there is this sense of unpredictability that cannot be observed through any means. Could you please restate like why he thinks that has something to do with something non-physical rather than just a lack of the means to observe everything to a point where you actually can predict it?
So I don't think, to be hyper clear, I don't think Feigl is a vitalist. I think as I think I say, the physical laws will prove sufficient here. Yes. So he says that for when it comes to the explanation and prediction of organisms, that physical laws will be sufficient. But to answer your question, I think that the notion of emergence is a pretty generally conceived. Let me think. I guess it's the notion of the whole being more than the sum of its parts is kind of at odds with the idea of looking at all the individual pieces and then being able to say, okay, now we can predict what the outcome will be.
Yeah, a strict sense of reductionism versus, say, a very strict interpretation of emergence in the sense where truly the system is more than the sum of its parts, as in there's really something about the whole system that would not be predictable from its parts. That would stand in opposition, I think, to that really reductionist approach. It's something that I have a hard time picturing myself. I really have a hard time conceiving of something that is in that very strict, very hard sense emergent, where you could say, no matter what we know about the parts, we would never be able to predict what this whole is doing based on the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
I find that just I have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
Yeah.
But I guess there is a certain school of thought where that's taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. So I thought that the point you made about how the ordinary is very important. I don't know if you can find the slide that goes with that, but it's about an ordinary kind of description or ordinary how we talk about. It was in the subjective objective thing, yeah. Over there.
Somewhere here.
Yeah, I think it was
Oh.
shortly after the point you made about, you know, that it is dangerous to look at the subjective in the sense that, you know, it's private experiences can't simply be taken as objective. They may be scientifically, but not cognitively meaningful. It was somewhere near there.
Well, let me pull up my notes.
But it doesn't really matter. I can just talk about it without the notes anyway. When I heard that, or when I heard you describe that the way we talk about our experiences ordinarily, or the way that we describe the mental or the physical in ordinary ways, rather than avoiding that. Like, say, you mentioned things like, God, what did you mention as an example? Did you mention something like grief? I think you mentioned grief and a
Yes.
few others, right?
Right here. Yes, here it is.
Yeah. I think that's extremely important, actually, this part. Because when we say that we want to achieve mind uploading, the kind of thing that we tend to think of when we say, well, when would it be a successful upload? It's exactly at that level. It's at the level where we are experiencing those kinds of things that we normally point to when we use normal language. And we say something like that, you know, somebody is going through grief at the moment, they're experiencing grief. And so we need to be able to talk about those kinds of concepts. And that's, I think, where, for instance, when you look at integrated information theory and similar approaches to talking about what might be an explanation, metric, what have you, of something as complex and difficult to talk about as consciousness, where they sort of go off in a direction that it doesn't help us very much. Because how can you describe in information theory, integrated information theory, that someone is experiencing grief? That's where if you have a global workspace approach or something that's more attention schema theory, it's easier to build a model, a self-model, and point to something like, well, this is what's responsible for pulling together the kinds of memory, attention, and sort of physiological responses that your body makes when you're going through this process that is the experience of grief.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that really puts a very, very concrete handle on those things. Whereas integration information theory, when it says, well, the phi is 0.25, yeah, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, as Feigl says, the task is neither to repudiate these or, or to rule them out, but to analyze the logical status of this sort of description and its relation to the neurophysiological descriptions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the level that we have to pay attention to if we want to describe success criteria. It's very relevant. And then, let's see. I did have a question there. There was something about the complex mechanical, like the bee was being given as an example. Doesn't it mean that there's an extensive mental life?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what's the process, or how is it determined that a bee doesn't have an extensive mental life? I'm not saying they do. I'm just wondering, how does one just draw that conclusion?
Yeah, I don't. I would be remiss to give a flippant, off the cuff, robust philosophical answer to that. I think that's I mean, panpsychism is kind of the argument that consciousness exists in down to the atomistic level. So that's I think in a way.
I wasn't even asking about consciousness as a concept. I'm just wondering, a rich internal or rich mental life can mean a lot of things, and it's before defining what it is exactly and how you judge it, it's hard to say that a bee does or doesn't have it. It's kind of like trying to determine whether there's intelligent life in the universe. And what we do is we try to detect signals that we would create if we're making radio channels and stuff,
Mhm.
because we assume that that's what intelligent life will do.
Mhm.
It's hard to make sure that that's exactly what you would expect, but okay, at least it's one example you could go and look for because we have that example here on Earth. And then I guess in a similar fashion, you could assume that a rich mental life for a bee would have to mean something similar as a rich mental life in a human. So then if we don't see them talking to each other, which they do actually in a way, but if we don't see them having parties and maybe bearing grudges and things like that, and occasionally having revolutions and things like that,
Yeah.
then maybe they don't have a rich inner life. But maybe we're just looking at only one facet of what a rich inner life is. It's similar to these arguments in AI, right, where some people will say, well, maybe there's already a super intelligent AI out there in the internet,
Yeah.
and we're just not recognizing it because it's so different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a
Well,
great question.
this is Dan here. There's this guy you probably never heard of, but his name's Dennis Hackathall, and he has this rather crazy idea that animals are not conscious because they're not creative, which I disagree with. But that's his argument. I don't. I
Oh,
mean,
so
I
he
think it's
simply redefined the word and said consciousness
yeah.
means creativity or something like that.
And also you have to realize that a lot of people don't have they don't have the same they don't actually understand what qualia is, and if somebody is not at that level yet, you have to you kind of have to back up a bit and actually explain it, because this was sort of a revelation to me. About a year ago, I met someone who uh, I actually met a few people who were explaining, like, it took them a long time to really internalize what qualia was. It's like the fish swimming in water doesn't necessarily know what water is.
Yeah.
It's like qualia. It's like, it may seem obvious to us, but other people, they don't get it, and they don't get the hard problem. So if somebody's not at that level yet, it's really like it's really pointless trying to have further discussion.
Yeah.
Also, just even then, though, let's be clear that even people who understand what the hard problem is may not agree that the hard problem exists. There's that too.
Totally.
Well,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's a whole nother thing. Yeah.
And Ken Hayworth has been very explicit about that, by the way. He absolutely does not believe that the hard problem exists.
Yeah. That's like the whole article of bad philosophy on Brain Preservation Foundation.
Just for clarification, is the hard problem being able to test?
It's
Maybe
it's being able to derive consciousness from the material, essentially. Like, it's not clear how consciousness, like, when we say fire is, a combustive reaction, like, we can define fire at a more reductive layer of analysis once we learn, like, the chemical composition. It isn't clear how consciousness arises from material underpinnings.
Okay, so I can see how, like from Ken's argument, because I know his method, or at least as I understand it, his primary method for whole brain emulation is taking taking all the information from the scanned brain and then just recreating it completely. As a very blunt way of putting it. But if you're going to try to build consciousness from the ground up, meaning if you actually have to put everything together by knowing what the actual mechanisms are, then you will have to understand it. Then you will actually have to be able to understand it physically, meaning put like a boundary between what you would define as the physical responsible mechanisms for consciousness aside from everything else. So at least as far as like emulating consciousness, there is a point where you would have to be able to have some kind of a physical definition for it, meaning like which sets of neurons are firing, um, and all of the other like chemical responses for that. I mean, is this what the question is actually pointing at? I just want to make sure that I'm kind of on the point here.
Is it okay if I start presenting for just a second, just to show
Yeah, of course.
the definition of the hard problem? Let's see if I can get this right here. The window I want to show is probably this one, I think. Can you see the bit about the hard problem of consciousness? Is it showing up?
No.
It's not. Okay, then it hasn't worked yet. What do I have to do to make it happen? Like the screen. Oh, I have to tell it that I allow that. Okay, I allow it. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so the hard problem, as for instance Chalmers and others talk about, is the problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena and experience. Why is there even such a thing as experience? How can there be such a thing? What is it even? Yeah.
Right. Well, what I'm seeing right now is your browser window.
Oh, you're not seeing that. Okay.
I'm not seeing that. I think you're
Weird. How does this not work? Maybe I should just select the screen instead of the window. That's probably the better thing to do.
Okay, so maybe to put it another way, the problem is being able to define a cognitive experience or a conscious experience in a way that is more like a materialistic sense.
I mean, the way I view it, I mean, it's been a while since I studied this stuff, but is explaining qualia. Like it's like it seems like there's something that emerges, so to say, which you can only experience by being the entity itself. So it's like, for instance, you've probably heard of the story about Mary the pain doctor who never experienced pain. Have you heard that one? Or like somebody who's another example would be like somebody who is blind. They can study all the optics of vision. They can study the neuroscience of vision, but there's something. The argument is there's something missing. There's the phenomenological experience, which of seeing the color red, which is which is called the qualia. And the hard problem is trying to figure out how you ever explain. How do you ever explain that in terms of
what
other
are
things?
Qualia? Why are there qualia? That sort of
I
thing.
actually buy into that a lot. And actually, Dennett, even somebody like Dennett, who doesn't really think the hard problem is a problem, he still recognizes that there is this thing of qualia, which it seems like you can only experience it firsthand. So that's
Yeah, I think that even if you don't think that there is some missing fact, if there's no no extra thing, nothing that's missing that needs to be brought in to explain qualia. So this is basically Ken Haver's position and that of many other materialists, that basically Chalmers' hard problem isn't a real problem in that sense, that there isn't an extra thing. You can still recognize that trying to describe why there is an experience of qualia, or why this even is a question, that's a real thing nonetheless. I think I kind of put myself in that camp, because I think that that what we're trying to capture, for instance, with whole brain emulation and mind uploading, is specifically that. It's qualia. It's the experience, right? We want to capture experience, our experience as it is. And so those things are super important. At the same time, when I ask myself, how is it possible that a system has qualia, a system with things that we have, which is bringing in a bunch of sensor data, processing it through filters that we've established through learning, bringing them together and establishing on top of that attention and associations with other patterns and emotions and responses that happen in our bodies and that mean something in that context. If you put all of that together, then in the end, I guess the way I put it is I find myself asking the question, what else would you expect it to be like if you were in a system like that? What other than this experience could it be?
Right. That's
So
basically Dennett's.
yeah,
Vaguely, that seems like Dennett's kind of view as well. Like if you're talking to someone, for instance, and they're able to explain it, the qualia, to you, like what reason do you have to believe that that's not a true account?
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Because I mean, the qualia obviously are going to seem super real to you because you are not just the one who is getting the sensory data and who is saying, I see a red rose and it looks beautiful. You're also the one who's putting that in your memory, and you're also the one who's judging that the qualia is right. You're your own judge, which is why I actually really liked the bit, Lennon, where you were basically pointing out how there's a difficulty in describing private experiences as objective, because in private experiences, you are always the judge of whether that was a true experience, even though we know that our brain, first of all, can only give us impressions of the things that we can actually detect, can only present them to us in ways that the brain, through its connectivity, can present them to us, and often is full of illusions. So, yeah, objective much? Probably not.
So shit.
I'm gonna have to drop out just because I'm kind of doing a bunch of things at once here. But we have. I just wanted to say we the U.S. Transhumanist Party is doing a live stream in about a half hour with Andreas Gomez Emelson,
Oh, yeah.
who I'm sure Randall knows him. And he's going to be talking about his research on qualia and states of consciousness. So if you're interested in that, it'll be live streamed on YouTube. Um, you can go to the Gennady Stolyarov's YouTube and look
Mhm.
for it, or go to Transhumanist Party on Twitter.
There's also a YouTube online where I debated Andres on his approach to consciousness, even though I really like what the Qualia Institute does. And just so you all know, we both won and we both lost.
Do you have a
Oh,
link
great!
there? I'm interested in
Yeah, I
that.
saw the one. I saw the one with Michael Johnson, which was incredibly fascinating. But I haven't watched the one from Carbon Copies with Andreas.
Yeah, I don't have the link handy right now, but it was recorded in, I think, a cafe or a sort of, yeah, cafe in Berkeley somewhere.
Is it on YouTube?
Somewhere, yeah. I mean, maybe I have a link somewhere in a playlist of mine. I just don't know for sure. I'd have to check.
What's the guy's name?
Andres Gomez Emilson. Um, let's see. Andres. Okay, wait, whoops. I had it right here. He's the director of research of the Qualia Institute.
So are we doing the metaphysics call today as well?
I feel like we're doing the metaphysics call right now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I know that Dan has to go, but I still had a couple of questions or points or whatever. So if you're still up to it or up for it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've got that link for the Transhumanist Party live stream. Nice. Oh, I'm still presenting. I didn't mean to keep presenting. Stop sharing. There. Yeah, so anyway, I think you did put your finger on some really important issues here. That issue about the ordinary and I guess qualia, and the danger of considering subjective as being objective in a sense, by considering private experience as objective. Oh yeah, there's this point about identical being either seen as complete similarity versus numerical oneness.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how to put that into words right now, but that seemed important to me.
I think analyzing. So as I said in the slides, analyzing the potential context for that. Like he said, one second, I gotta pull up the. No, that's not it. No, that's not it. Not
So I just want to make a point about quality being subjective. That seems to be presuming that that there is a limit to what you could be able to take out of the information from the brain, which I think they're a more realistic way to deduce that it's just there is a difficulty with being able to test your experiments, because that would involve because without knowing a lot about it, you have to be able to take someone's subjective experience of that to be able to confirm that. If you have all the information, though, however that ends up being, then you should be able to then understand what someone's subjective interpretation or judgment of an experience would be. At least that's what it makes sense. Because if every
all of the
So Michael, you do see a way for a blind person to experience the color red if they just have a very careful, good description of it.
Yes.
I actually agree.
Okay.
I disagree.
Yeah, I think that so I agree, but it takes a lot. Like, if you want to describe to a person who is blind what it is like to see the color red, then you've got to go through a lot of hoops. If you can't just give them the color, give them sight, you have to somehow give them all the associations that the sighted person is getting, but provide them through some other way.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a whole level of like learning that they've got to do.
Under that conception, I might agree.
Yeah, like when let's be careful about using the comparison of just describing to a blind person what red is, because when you are like, let's see here, I'm trying to maybe give a little bit more understanding about what you're trying to do, without just saying something like simulate the color red and having or giving them sight. I guess maybe you already said it well, is that you have to understand it carefully enough to be able to do that, which
I think actually your term simulate is a really good one to use. Because what I'd like to say, because you know how just before this I was pointing out that using what we experience as an objective test is difficult because the brain can only represent the things that it is wired to represent to us, and that it has the input for, and that there are a lot of illusions. Another way of saying this is that the brain is only presenting a simulation of the real world to us at all times. So we're always, all of us, even the sighted ones, are simulating what it's like to see the color red.
Okay, that makes sense.
But could we not then argue that what it means to see the color red is the simulation of
Yeah.
the color red?
It's that you have a simulation of the color red, and that simulation, if you wanted to give the non-sighted person a simulation of the color red, it would have to be one that corresponds sufficiently. This is where this whole bit about complete similarity and stuff like that comes in again. Corresponds sufficiently with what the sighted person is getting. But all the time, it's just a simulation. Nothing about our experience is the real world. Like even just, solid table, and yet none of the atoms actually touch. It's mostly vacuum. So what does this mean that I felt a solid table? I'm getting some kind of impulses back, forces, through my arm, proprioception, into my brain, simulating that there's an actual barrier here, a surface that is real. So that is all a simulation. It's giving us a certain kind of perception of the world around us. Something that lives in water may have a totally different perception of the world because most things you can just go through. But you can imagine that you could come about that simulation differently. Like you could build that simulation in a virtual environment where walls are made of pixels. And similarly, a blind person could be given sight through other means. In fact, I kind of think that this whole thing is really the whole basis of our notion that whole brain emulation would be possible at all. It's that you can replace a real function with another version of it and get the same essential effect.
I'd really recommend this paper, by the way, in regards to what you're referring to, Randall.
Evil genius?
It's like exactly what you're talking about.
Descartes' evil genius.
It's definitely one of my favorite philosophical papers I've actually fully read.
Is there any like a strong consensus on this? Is for when it comes to being able to test a simulation of a subjective point of view. Is it still very is the process of how to do that still very muddily understood, or like with just some like theories about how that would work, or is there some kind of like a highly agreed upon way to do that? Like for instance, do we still have to just build the simulation and then ask the simulation if it makes sense?
Yeah, one part of the problem with that question is that it depends on your philosophy whether or not we do have the means. Because if your philosophy is really the Dennett type of philosophy, or what I was just describing, then you could say that creating a subjective experience or subjective point of view, it could be a simple little Python program, something that has an internal state and that it judges things based on. That could be the subjective point of view. And then you could agree that that subjective view may not be as complex and rich as the one we have, but that it is a subjective point of view, an experience, and that you just built one. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, even if you built an entire whole brain emulation and that person came up to you and said, yes, I know what it feels like to see a red rose, then the person who is on the opposite side of Dennett's spectrum might say, no, you don't. You're just an emulation. I don't believe that what you're experiencing is real at all.
Yeah.
What basis do they have to make that judgment? It's just their belief, their personal philosophy. The thing running inside their emulation or simulation or whatever you want to call it. So they're just using that to judge everything else.
But do you believe that in reality, one of these options or something is between is really true, and that we just can't find which one?
That we can find out which one. I hold out hope that there's a way to describe or to come up with, to at least at some point be able to say that within all of these contexts, that view is not sensible, and within these contexts, maybe it is sensible. Maybe we can at least do that kind of categorization where we can say that, and then eventually, hopefully, we could say that for all intents and purposes, within the whole set of contexts that apply to this is a living being that we consider having personhood, that then one particular approach is the right way to look at things. And I mean, of course, I think it's the one that we're taking. I'm not on the opposite side, obviously. But I hold out hope that even if we can't absolutely make those distinctions, because there's always an argument a philosopher can make, right? That that at least we can achieve a better categorization like that, or some kind of a split, some way of making judgments based about which approach you should take or which views are more sensible. I think that's the sort of thing that you see when people talk about progress in philosophy. You can see a kind of shift over time as an understanding of a domain becomes better and more detailed. Yeah.
It reminds me about one thing that Guido wrote in one of his articles I wrote for publications. Is he suggested that if you could make a prosthetic that could be hooked to your original brain and being able to experience an emulated brain, then you could compare the different experiences and see if and then be able to make a judgment, like which one, like if they did have the same subjective experience, or if there was a difference between your normal brain and the emulation. I like that because it offers at least an idea to a practical approach to being able to determine if the emulated brain has similar subjective experiences. And unfortunately, that's the only way that I can see right now would be the way to test it.
So I have some questions about that, though. I also thought it was a nice idea because I think that it would be great if new technology actually offers us new ways to do philosophy, or psychology. But I have some questions because when you're hooking up to this when you're making a connection between two brains, between this whole brain emulation and your own brain, and you're judging what the experience is like, are you judging it because you are basically turning off your own brain and just experiencing through the whole brain emulation, in which case your judgment is the same as the subjective judgment of that whole brain emulation, and therefore do you gain any power of judgment there? Or are you doing it by what? By like somehow incorporating how this whole brain emulation works and all of its parts into your brain so that you can now actually experience it? Because what does it mean that you've made a connection between two things and that you are both experiencing the same thing? What does it actually mean that you are now both experiencing this? What does it mean? Like, is it like when I mean, because we have a connection right now, we're talking through this. There is a connection here. Does this mean that in some sense I am experiencing what's in your head because we're talking? What does it really mean? And if it means that you need to be as integrated as possible, then can we say that you can only ever really solve the question in the end once everybody is a hive mind and we all make the same subjective experience that yes, we're all a conscious hive mind?
Okay, you're making it. Go ahead. Yeah.
The weakness you are pointing at is real, but that still seems a good direction to search answers in.
Okay, I just
yes,
think that
it's
the philosophers
difficult to define.
They're probably going to say that we're not really giving them a solution, we're just giving them a trick, something that makes people feel like they can say, oh, I agree, that's real, but they're being tricked because now they're just feeling what that machine is feeling or something like that, or they're not, or they're making a judgment through the machine's judgments.
Yeah, that definitely presents a problem now that you put it that way, because you sure don't want to make a device that can turn anything off in your brain if you are just using it for testing. That would be.
It gets worse, by the way, because the same problem exists between different parts of your own brain right now.
Oh.
They're all just connected. Can one part of the brain really know what the other part's going through? how unified is all of this even? Like, what does it mean that you are experiencing the sight of a red rose, like, say, for, I don't know, your memory systems or your planning or
James
like,
Blackman writes about the WADA test and the different hemispheres of the brain, which are all generating their own experiences, which are exactly, again, like
yeah. So the
this
same
issue.
thing as the connection between like the human and the whole brain emulation, you've already got that going on in your head right now.
Well, can you even be sure that right now on the substrate of your brain does not exist another person for whom you do not experience anything and who sees red roses completely differently?
I can't prove that you're wrong, that this could be true. Yep.
One idea I have in a similar direction is to make brain interfaces to interact with some machines, probably either virtual reality or robotic bodies in real world, with feedback, like two-way interaction,
Hmm.
and something like getting used to inhabiting a different body and feeling for that body. It might both shed some light on the questions we are now discussing, and also it really might help shift the view on those questions in the society.
No, I think that's very valid. Michael, didn't you also write something similar or have some similar ideas?
I think so. Well, what I was going to say is that, and if I could just kind of reiterate, like what you said about the point that I raised about what Guido says, that can go so far as to the extent of having an understanding of what experiencing a simulation or experiencing the artificial perceptions would be like. But if you are still using your own brain to do the interpreting, to do the judgment of the experience, so there's still a limit.
How do you do that though? How do you judge an experience happening somewhere else?
Well, from what it seems like Arseny was saying is you replace your sensory perceptions with a different set of sensory perceptions that are connected to
Right. So, like,
the art
let's
of.
say instead of your own retina, you've got a camera. It's over there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a pretty like that's concrete, and I can imagine that very simple situation where you can then judge whether or not looking through that camera at something is similar to the way that you look at things with your eye. Now the rest of your visual system's still the same. It's just the camera. It's just like people who get these new, these retinal prostheses these days, right? And this was actually also the direction I was going in thinking about Arsenie's proposal, which I think is interesting and good. Because nowadays you've got some people who get a magnet implanted in their finger so that they can feel like, magnetic fields. You can get a sense of that and see what it's like to feel that. That's a bit similar. It's trying to experience something a little different. Of course, someone else might then claim, oh, well, being able to just sense that there is, having the magnetism translated into an actual feeling of pushing and pulling within your finger, which your finger already can feel, of course. You already have an ability to feel, pressure. That's a translation happening. And in that sense, then that wouldn't be any different than, say, sitting in a kayak and feeling how the pressure on your legs as you're moving the kayak around, and then feeling like you are in the kayak, that's part of your body. So how different is it to have that natural connection, that translation between the new sensory format and your old sensory format? How different is that from the one where you plug in directly? If you're plugging into the same channel, like replace the retina with a camera, then it's probably not that much different, even if maybe it's worse because it has fewer pixels or something. It's not essentially different. But if you take this, they've also done, of course, like in primates, for instance, they've done experiments where you will just take a robot arm, and instead of connecting it with the primate's arm, you just plug it into a random location in the brain, like somewhere in the prefrontal cortex or something like that, or the motor cortex, somewhere. And the brain tends to be smart enough that it can learn to then use that arm, can use this new set of in and outputs. Yeah, what is the monkey experiencing then?
Are such arms having two-way interface? Like, do they do any input into my monkey brain?
I don't know the exact experiment. I'd have to read the papers. I would be surprised if they never tried anywhere it did. I'd be surprised if they never tried anything with feedback. But I don't know the papers, so I can't say for sure.
And I completely agree with this idea for being able to experience an artificial sensory perception. But what I was getting at is it's a lot more confusing and complex when you're trying to experience more higher level of brain functions. Like let's say, what if you could, because this might be a little bit more practical than trying to replace like your cognitive functions. Like what if you replaced, and by replaced I mean that you actually cut off the connection between your biological hippocampus and you then connected an artificial hippocampus, and then you could like well, actually, maybe thinking about it, that doesn't sound very practical at all, does it? Okay. But what I was getting to is, well, I don't know. Like if you disconnect your biological hippocampus at all, that would probably kill you. I don't know if you probably always. Okay.
It wouldn't kill you. There are tons of people who lose their hippocampus or the hippocampal function completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the point that I was trying to get to is that with the point of this, you're trying to gain some experience and understanding about what it means to have an emulated something part of your brain, but it would.
And this was most certainly done in both rodents and non-human primates. This is a part of the experiments that Ted Berger's group did. They did the one in humans where they just have the neuroprosthetic processor there together with the slightly damaged hippocampus of the patients. But in animal, they certainly removed the function of the original hippocampus and put in just the prosthetic device.
Okay. There is still, though, the problem of being able to make the judgment. Then I suppose if you do actually replace your hippocampus, then you're losing your biological memories of what it's like to experience things. So then you can't actually make the connection.
Well,
you still
we know what it's like for people to lose that, because there are plenty of patients who do not have functioning hippocampi in both hemispheres, and it's disturbing for them because every morning they wake up not exactly knowing why they're in the situation that they're in, but they can mostly function, because their short-term memory is intact and they have their long-term memory still, so they can function. It's not crazy, and from what they say, it doesn't feel like there's something alien about it. It's just that there's this thing they can't do. It's like some people can't ride a bike, they can't remember things. And in a similar way, I guess you could point out that the rodents and the primates where these experiments were done, they didn't freak out and behave like, oh my God, what the hell's wrong with my brain? It's just that they now had this neuroprosthetic memory thing that's helping them do the experiment to some degree, and they just work with it. It's like they're not aware of what's going on, really. But it's the same as with, hemisphere neglect patients who really don't know that they're neglecting that one part of their body they're not aware of. We are very, very lousy at judging our own sort of system and whether it's complete or not and what we might be missing. We don't really have good self-diagnostics.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's still worthwhile to experience an artificial sensory perception, and from what it seems like, then it's also worthwhile to possibly experience artificial hippocampal replacements. So, at what level do you keep on replacing the brain to be to the point where you can say, well, you're not really experiencing it enough because there's not enough of your biological brain left to be able to even make that judgment. All that's already been replaced. Yeah, I'm all for the sensory perception because that's kind of separate from your cognitive functions. Meaning like your ability to interpret everything. But like you can't just replace like the things responsible for judgment and awareness, and say that you now have an experience of what it's like to have that, because you can't make the comparison because your biological mechanisms for being able to turn that is now gone. I hope I'm making my point clear enough.
I know what you're saying, but just for the sake of argument, just because that's what we like to do in these kinds of sessions, we like to argue. is that I'm wondering. You said that you can't just replace your sense of judgment or awareness. I mean, what if you did? Would it then suddenly be false? Like if I replaced your biological center making judgments on whether your experiences are whole with another.
Well, then at least it could be argued that it's not you making judgment.
What is making judgments in you right now? Because, I mean, neurons themselves are experiencing the same problem that we described between regions of the brain, or between you and a whole brain emulation, or me and you. The neurons are also just sitting there and receiving signals from one another. It's not like they are magically some kind of whole that, they're also just things.
Well, yeah, but the opposition implicitly uses one or another of the views that Lennon described well.
I know.
I am. I'm
sorry. I totally am already on board with a certain view. Yeah. I admit that.
And I wasn't trying to imply that you can't replace it, but the point of the experiment is so that you can get some crossover between the emulated system and your biological system, so that you can have a subjective experience to be able to make a judgment between the two. But if you are completely taking out your original your original mechanisms for interpretation, then you cannot use that to make the comparison.
In that kind of makes your experiment not work.
That's what I was getting at. Yeah.
I see.
Hypothetically, of course not practical, if you don't swap out the entire region that is responsible for judgment, roughly saying. But I don't know, let's say you swap out one neuron for an artificial thing. You can somewhat hope that your judgment is not impaired too much, so that you can not decide about how you perceive it, how is your judgment working at the moment, and so on.
True, but
then you swap out that neuron back and swap out another one, and so on. And then you swap more than one at a time. given that it's like a bootstrapping process. Like you make sure that swapping some part to the artificial implementation doesn't change your ability for judgment, and then you use that confirmed ability of judgment to make a judgment about what you perceive while other parts are swapped out.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Your version is the kind though where you're basically randomly picking individual ones that you're swapping out. I find I'm very curious about something more hierarchical, because even the system that we're calling judgment isn't just one thing, right? There's the part that is there's where different patterns are coming together. Then there's some sort of there's probably another filter, another threshold. There's a piece where it leads into making responses or writing away something into at least a temporary memory buffer where you're kind of holding your judgment or your temporary conclusions. There are all sorts of pieces in that as well. It's not one thing. So you could imagine replacing one layer of that and not the other. So maybe you actually judged it was a completely different experience, but you're responding, yeah, that was the same.
Yeah, your verbal system is totally different to necessarily your interior representations of things.
Yeah, I'm only saying this, by the way, because just to make a further point about how artificial it is that we think that we are really good subjective judges of ourselves or the world around us, when in reality there are all those parts that are part of us doing that and making these kinds of behavioral responses. So if Michael says, I am currently conscious, what reason do I have to believe him? Because he could, his system could be lying.
Yeah, of course, but for us as
and his system could be lying to himself.
That's disputable, I think, because, well, if an illusion is a perception not corresponding to reality, it's still
I'm impressed
a
that we
perception.
just made Thomas run out of disk space. Doesn't Thomas have like 40 terabytes or something of disk space? That's crazy.
Ooh.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, Google hasn't run out yet, so we're still streaming. Sorry, Arseny.
Yeah, I was sort of arguing with the idea that the system making judgment about perception might be lying to itself.
You could imagine, though, if you had a computer program, right, that was trying to evaluate something, and then in the end it's supposed to write true or false. But what if I put in a little extra circuit that just flips the bit from true to false? Then suddenly the system's lying to itself.
Yeah, but
that's a really good analogy.
It's a question of about what you are or are not lying to yourself. Because if an illusion is a perception that doesn't correspond to reality, it's still a perception. And I don't really see how an existence of perception can be an illusion, because an illusion is a perception. So
yeah, but what if you
Arseny, you should also read the Botswana paper.
Which one? Okay, yeah.
But what if you changed your perception so that your illusions are now different? Like you're no longer susceptible to the same visual illusions, but now to different ones. And does that mean that your visual system doesn't work, or just that your illusions don't work? Or like, what does it actually mean?
That really might mean different things. What I was arguing is only that you can't. The fact that you have perception itself, I think, cannot be an illusion.
True,
because
but
what about when I'm dreaming?
Yeah. You still perceive something?
No, I'm imagining all kinds of stuff. I had these wild dreams last night, and I could swear during those dreams that I thought I was perceiving things.
You were perceiving things, but you weren't perceiving
were.
things that correspond to reality.
Oh, okay. So we're not talking about perception that originates from sensation, but like
No, we are not.
generated imagery and stuff like that too.
Yeah, if I may.
We are talking about qualia in general.
Yeah, we weren't trying to say that the perception would be incorrect. We're trying to verify whether or not the perception is the same as the original. Because when you replace those neurons responsible for a certain perception, the goal is to be able for the system to be able to determine whether or not that is the same as the original.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be able to retain the information of the original perception to be able to make that comparison. But if you
Do you know how many people think that they can actually tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but when you do the test with them, they can't?
well, okay.
But maybe so. But to use your own reasoning from earlier, Randall, maybe they can actually tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but they can't verbally accurately report.
Oh, sure. Maybe they're lying to themselves about it. Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying
the
that I
exact
know
reasoning you're
where
employing.
something's going wrong, and I'm just saying that maybe that judgment isn't so reliable, or not as
Yeah.
reliable as we wish it were.
Well, but
Well,
yeah.
At least if by such still hypothetical experiment of swapping out one part than another and so on, we find out that nobody can differentiate one thing from another.
Yeah,
As
I'm
with
being too
Coke and
I'm being
Pepsi.
way too out there, because you're right. Of course, that this is still useful.
Then
right?
it doesn't matter if we
Because,
can
I
really
mean,
differentiate or not.
I can say that people can't tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but they can probably tell if it's Coke or lemonade or something like that. So there are degrees of how finely tuned our judgments are. Yeah.
And if we cannot differentiate between perception with biological brain and perception with emulated brain, then it's everything we need. We don't need those perceptions to actually be the same. We need that it feels the same.
Yeah. And the evil genius would, of course, simply remove the parts of your brain that would object to the new perception of how things are. And then you'd be fine with it, and everything's cool. Now, you also happen to always follow the great leader and never question orders.
That's an obvious shortcut, of course, here.
So it seems like for the system to accurately make a comparison between the two different types of experiences, there has to be some sort of an experiment where both of the pieces of information can exist at the same time, so the system can, meaning the person making the subject in the experiment can have the information that the system needs to be able to make the comparison. Like this is very, very easy when you are just swapping out your sensory perception, because your hippocampus still remembers what your biological eyes look at when they're looking at red. They can then like remember what the camera is looking at when it's looking at red. And so then I guess if you are going to go to the example of replacing a hippocampus, like if you say you are able to isolate the memory of let's just like you were able to isolate the memory of drinking Pepsi, and and you also were able to then somehow maybe I'm making this too complicated by picking an example. But what I'm trying to say is that if you were able to have the original hippocampus location for a certain kind of memory, and I guess sure Pepsi can work. And then if you can also include a prosthetic that has also the same hippocampal functions for lemonade, and if that subject can also, if that subject can be able to retrieve the information from both of those two locations, then they should be able to determine the difference between them. So that would be the way that it could work.
Combination of using the actual objective information that we have, like a thing that can show us which areas in your brain are lighting up when you're drinking Coke. And also, of course, from your emulated brain, a representation that shows you exactly which neurons are lighting up when you're drinking Coke. So you've got this objective comparison between the systems that are very similar because we've built them to be similar. And then on top of that, your judgment that you're still collecting. So from a practical point of view, this combination of using the objective and using the subjective, even if we don't completely trust it, as at least some kind of threshold for this is successfully a replacement. I think that works. I think that ultimately that is correct. It's just that it only works because we're already making a certain assumption about which philosophy is correct. We're assuming that you can do that. I think that if we weren't, we're philosophers of a different bent, that then we would object to this approach as being a reliable approach.
Yeah.
We cannot go on without any assumptions about philosophy.
I agree. I think
because solipsism might be true and nothing exists.
And we kind of, the funny thing is, as a materialist, I kind of already think that, except not. As in, I'm not really a solipsist, not an actual hardcore solipsist, but that whole thing about what we think the world is just what the brain is showing you. That simulation thing.
Yeah, I meant the hardcore strain of solipsism.
Yeah.
I also wanted to note that the idea about experience of inhabiting artificial bodies before going to the emulation might be useful in a more practical way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean practical as not as more useful, but as just without philosophical complexities.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, if we go directly to brain emulation, we would have to pass information about the world as encoded into our usual senses by some, I don't know, artificial sensors and software, and we'll have to try to convert it to something as much similar to what our sensors, biological sensors, would send as possible. But that can't be really good at first. So it would be definitely lower quality than just being in a biological body. But if we, prior to that, have experience of inhabiting artificial bodies or virtual reality, or maybe adding some sensorial modalities which we don't yet have, like not having magnet in a finger which translates, but having something directly plugged into brain as those robotical hands for the monkeys, if they have feedback. It gives much wider set of options as for interacting with the real world after uploading, which would not be inferior.
Yeah, I think it has very practical implications there. I would be, in fact, personally, if I were uploaded, I would very much be in favor of, or even before then, I'd be interested in trying that out or testing it. I was just thinking this about the trajectory and sort of predictions about how long it would take to get an artificial body to be as good as a real one. And I was wondering if maybe our assumption should be that it would take the same sort of trajectory as with digital cameras, where, in the beginning, a digital camera was kind of like a fun joke because, of course, a real camera with film had such a greater resolution and could represent things so much better. But now even the professionals only use digital cameras because in the last few years it's just gotten so vastly much better. So I'm imagining, or hoping that it's the same thing with digital bodies, that basically the artificial body development can go through cycles so much more quickly than evolution. That
That's sort of an idea,
yeah.
And not trying to closely resemble and closely translate into what biological senses are. Not like trying to support an old code, but just rewrite it completely in a way.
And so, Randall, and two questions just to clarify. You're by an artificial body, you're referring to everything at the moment other than the brain. But I guess to even further clarify, you're talking about a physical artificial body or a virtual one. Meaning, although I guess if it was virtual, you have to include whole brain emulation too. So I guess you probably are referring to a physical.
I was referring to a physical one. I think a lot of the same things would apply to a virtual one, as in the virtual bodies, when you first write the programs for what those bodies are going to be like, it might be really difficult to make one that is as closely resembling ours as possible, that has such sophistication, that has such delicate sensation all across its body or something like that. But that within a few years of development, you could get to at least that level. I imagine that could be similar as in the physical, probably.
I completely agree with that. I think it's just kind of actually at this point inevitable that the brain is going to be the last thing that's replaced.
And by replaced, you mean not just whole brain emulation, but you mean really changed, as in become a more sophisticated version of some sort.
Yes. Well, that too. I guess I was thinking, like, specifically when you can, we'll get to the point where you can create an artificial, other than the brain, you'll be able to make a point where you can create an artificial apparatus. You know what I mean? Like something that can replace everything other than the brain. That at least.
Oh, you actually meant keep the real brain, but put it into an artificial body, sort of like in RoboCop.
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems like at least as far as like the technological challenge, it seems like that's going to be before whole brain emulation. At least that's my assumption.
I think in terms of the technology needed, you're probably right. Of course, it doesn't serve the same goal, because even a brain in a new robotic body is still an aging brain.
Oh yeah, I was just making an observation. As far as the whole the artificial sensory perception topic was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of was my point. So let me see if I can think of something to add.
Or maybe we just say that we've reached a natural end of the conversation now that we're 2.5 hours in.
I guess I have just
no,
one
it's not
more.
2.5 hours, is it? It's how long has it been now? It's been 2 hours, right? Or am I completely off? Yeah, it's 2 hours. Yeah.
I guess I just have one more point. As far as getting to the first, like when we are going to start replacing, like say like a piece of the hippocampus again, for example, or rather, or replacing any part of it. Do we have the means to be able to see like what pieces of the brain are responsible for what, to be able to make the first prosthetic, to be able to even test it, because like if we just make one by seeing like which neurons light up in an MRI scan, I guess we still have something, but we can't really even take in like the we can't even use like first person subjective experience to test it, without even having something to start with in the first place. So that's my question: is how do you get
I
to
don't
having
know
the
if
first?
I don't know if I'm understanding you entirely correctly, but if the question was, would we be using MRI scans to build a neuroprosthetic? The answer is no. That's
Oh,
not how you make. That's not how you make them. Even now, with the simple ones that the Berger Lab's working with, you of course need to record at a much higher resolution. So really, from neurons and not just these large areas that an MRI can see. The MRI example was just one that I gave to say, if you've built a system that closely resembles a brain in how it works, then you can also generate an artificial MRI that you could compare with a real MRI so that you would have a live view of, are these things working in a similar way objectively, even if you can't see the detail in that version. Because, live views on brains where you see all of the neurons lighting up are very difficult. MRIs, where you're looking at a much sort of more abstract level where you're just seeing large populations, is more doable. So if you're trying to watch that live, it's easier.
okay. And I wasn't specifically trying to point out MRIs. I guess to put my question another way, do we have the means to build? Do we have the means to get to a starting point with building prosthetics without using first person subjective experience as a means to test it? Because in order to be able to do that, we actually have to have a prosthetic to exist in the first place to be able to make those tests. That's what I was getting at.
Mostly, I mean, if you just look at the hippocampal example, or retina, or cochlear, or anything else, or just physical, like prosthetic limbs, any type of prosthesis, it's usually tested in animals first. So by definition, you're not getting a subjective first-person account. They don't tell you. So that's always the first place you go. So it's purely behavioral. You put them in an experiment and you see if they can do the experiment with the new prosthesis.
Okay, so I guess to even make my question even more simplistic, there aren't any roadblocks that we simply just don't know how to move forward yet, as far as building a prosthetic to start with.
Well, nothing except for all the practical roadblocks, like how do you make an electrode that connects to millions of neurons at once, that sort of thing.
Okay, I see. Huh.
Which has gotten better. We can connect to thousands at once now, which is a lot better than it was years ago when it was tens at once.
Okay, so there's still a huge engineering problem. Okay,
Absolutely.
not that that's surprising.
It's
Yeah.
not surprising, no, and luckily that's where advances can be made. But yeah, I don't think there's no philosophical or scientific argument, some kind of thing where we say we just have no idea where we should even look for this person's brain. Is the brain actually located in the head or in the foot or what? We do not know. We have no clue. Like some really fundamental thing that keeps us from building neuroprosthesis, I don't think we have that. No.
Yeah. Good point, Randall.
Okay, I think I'm satisfied with that.
Now I'm wondering if our consciousness is actually in the foot, but yeah, maybe not.
Which one, left or right?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. And what if consciousness is in the left foot and identity is in the right one? We really have a problem. So I guess maybe Lenin, this is it, huh? this is the end of your journal club presentation.
Lennon, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'll have to go through the recording, and so I can actually wrap my head around more about the material from that. But yeah, thank you very much. I appreciated this.
And I'm going to read Evil Genius right away because that looks interesting. So thanks for sharing that.
Definitely integrally related to the ideas of illusion and identity and what we take to be reality.
Perfect. Thanks.
Do you think it makes sense? I have an obligation at 1:30 to my landlord. Do you think it makes sense to, at the future point, do a journal club potentially on Evil Genius or on the second half of?
We can totally do another journal club at some point, or we can just discuss it in the metaphysics conversations if you want to. I'm game for either. Also, quick message to Thomas here. Don't worry about the disk space issue. Thank you so much for being there and trying to save it on your disk at the same time. Of course, you can still always download the stream that YouTube has now stored somewhere, I assume, unless you missed a part of it. Very good, yeah. Also, again, if you ever feel like we should get you some more discs because you're doing all this storage stuff for us, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to donate something to help you with that. Okay. All right. Cool. So Lennon, yeah, whichever format is fine by me. Where if we do it as a journal club or just a conversation.
Okay. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for hearing me out.
Okay. Then
Thank you, Lennon.
bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Sure, yeah. And I just did too.